Loneliness is often dismissed as just a passing emotional state, something people feel when they are alone for too long. But neuroscience tells a very different story. Because when loneliness enters the brain, it doesn't behave like a simple feeling. It behaves like a signal that something about social connection has gone wrong. And once that signal activates, the brain doesn't just observe it, it reacts. Loneliness is not just a mental state. It is the brain's interpretation of social disconnection. The brain treats it as a warning system tied to survival. For millions of years, human survival depended on group belonging. So, today, when someone experiences isolation, the brain can interpret it as a form of danger. This is why researchers describe loneliness as a brain signal, and not just an emotion. When social connection processing is disrupted, the brain begins to shift into a protective mode, even if there is no physical threat present. Inside the brain, several regions begin to respond almost immediately. The amygdala activation increases, heightening threat detection networks. The brain starts scanning the environment for rejection, exclusion, or danger. At the same time, the anterior cingulate cortex activity rises, and this is the same region associated with distress related to social pain. And surprisingly, studies show something even more powerful. Emotional pain and physical pain are processed in overlapping neural circuits. That means social rejection doesn't just feel bad. It is encoded similarly to physical injury. The insula involvement in emotion also increases, as intensifying internal awareness of discomfort. The body begins to register loneliness not just mentally, but physically. Once the brain interprets loneliness as a threat, the stress response system activates. This leads to a cortisol increase, preparing the body for survival mode. Heart rate rises, blood pressure increases, energy systems shift. From a biological perspective, the body behaves as if it is under pressure to fix social survival. This is why loneliness is linked with emotional distress, sleep disruption, chronic fatigue, and even long-term immune suppression. Because the brain is not designed to stay in threat detection for long periods, but here is where things become even more important. Loneliness doesn't just activate the brain, it reshapes it. Through neuroplasticity, yet repeated experiences of isolation begin to alter neural pathways. The brain starts building stronger emotional learning circuits tied to rejection sensitivity, negative interpretation bias, and social expectation mismatch. Over time, synaptic rewiring can reinforce the belief that social situations are unsafe or unrewarding. This creates a cognitive emotional feedback loop. Loneliness leads to threat perception, leads to withdrawal, leads to more loneliness. As this loop continues, emotional regulation in the brain begins to weaken. People often experience emotional dysregulation, loneliness-induced anxiety, and repetitive rumination cycles. The brain begins to overanalyze social interactions. A delayed reply becomes rejection. A neutral expression becomes judgment. A small silence becomes exclusion. This is where perceived social threat becomes more powerful than actual social reality. And slowly, loneliness starts to amplify itself from the inside. In today's digital age, loneliness behaves differently than in the past, because the brain is constantly exposed to curated lives, relationships, and social validation online. This creates social comparison effects that distort emotional perception. The brain begins to measure personal connection against idealized relationships, curated lifestyle pressure, and constant social validation needs. This leads to a modern paradox: hyperconnectivity, isolation. Even while being surrounded by digital interaction, the brain may still experience a perceived belonging gap. And that gap intensifies emotional discomfort. When loneliness meets social media, a new feedback loop begins. Doom scrolling. E-comparison and online validation seeking temporarily stimulate the brain's reward system, but not enough to satisfy real social bonding needs. This leads to brain reward system disruption, emotional prediction errors, and increased attention inward focus. Instead of connection, the brain receives fragmented social signals, and the result is often deeper loneliness in a connected world. As emotional discomfort increases, behavior begins to shift. The brain starts to avoid social risk. This creates avoidance behavior, self-isolation cycle, and motivation loss in loneliness. Each avoidance reinforces the belief that social interaction is difficult or unsafe. This is where isolation feedback loops become deeply embedded. The brain learns from experience, and if the experience is withdrawal, it strengthens withdrawal pathways. But neuroscience also reveals something important. The brain is adaptable. Even after prolonged loneliness, neuroplasticity remains active. This means emotional conditioning can be reversed through experience-dependent change. When individuals gradually re-enter social environments, new neural pathways begin to form. This process includes behavioral activation, emotional regulation strategies, and cognitive restructuring. Even small interactions can begin to rebuild emotional safety circuits in the brain. Recovery does not require sudden transformation. It requires gradual reconnection. Things like community engagement, group belonging therapy, nature exposure, and structured social interaction can help reduce stress response activation and restore balance in emotional processing systems. Even sunlight exposure and time in natural environments can reduce cortisol levels and stabilize mood regulation networks. The brain begins to relearn a simple truth. Connection is not a threat, it is safety. Loneliness is not just about being alone. It is about how the brain interprets connection, expectation, and emotional safety. It reshapes threat detection networks, influences emotional regulation, and can even alter long-term behavioral patterns through neuroplasticity. But just as the brain can learn isolation, it can also learn connection again, because the same system that rewires itself for loneliness can also rewire itself for belonging. And finally, if you like this content, do us a favor. Like, subscribe, and stay connected for more videos like this.